Hi, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. It's Choosing Books for the Year 6 Classroom. I'm Nikki Gamble, and I'm delighted to be joining you along with my special guest today, Stephen Connor. It's a wonderful, bright, sunny day. So if you're joining us today, thank you so much for taking time out of the sunshine to be with us. If you're actually watching this on replay, then maybe you made a wise decision. I'm really sorry to be blocking out the sunshine with these curtains today. I'm joining you from a hotel, but Stephen, as you can see with his wonderful backdrop, is joining you from a real classroom, and he's got lots of fantastic real books with him. So Stephen is a Year 6 teacher in Derbyshire, but as always, I'd like to invite him to tell you a little bit about his current role. I would say, if I was summing him up, that he is a reading advocate extraordinaire, but I'm sure there's a lot more to it than that.
Thanks, Nick. It's very kind. As you say, I'm teaching in South Derbyshire at the moment in a small village school. So we've got a school of about 145 children at the moment. So we're quite small. One of our focuses has been trying to push reading for pleasure, particularly broadening the horizons of our children and giving them an opportunity to read more widely. So in my role as Key Stage 2 lead and English lead, that's what we've been trying to do. So we're trying to get parents involved with regular reading newsletters, updating the library regularly as well. So we're progressing. It's a work in progress for sure.
And in small schools, how many on roll in your school?
It's around 145 at the moment.
Right. So you have to do the same as much larger schools on a much reduced budget.
Yes. And obviously that affects all areas of the curriculum. But when it comes to reading, whenever we have a little bit of extra money in the pot, we do ask that we spend it on books. And I know Just Imagine have been very generous as well in supporting us with that. Parents have been very good. So we asked parents at the end of last year, we worded a lovely letter and saying we always appreciate gifts, but if you are thinking of buying a teacher a gift, if you could send a book to school instead. Sorry, that was for Christmas rather. And that worked really well. And the children were all really excited to see all the new books around school too. So
how fantastic.
There's different ways.
That's fabulous. And of course, one of the things that you are interested in, I just do want to mention it, is end papers. Tell us a little bit about your interest with end papers.
So I don't know where it came from. I just started looking at end papers and thinking they're interesting. There was an A.F. Harold book, The Imaginary, which we might talk about later. And Emily Gravett did the illustrations and the end papers, and they were just absolutely stunning. You could have them as clothing, you could have them as wallpaper, you could have them as prints just hanging on your wall frames. They were just amazing, and it just caught my eye. And every now and again, I started to notice more and more. And sometimes they're just wonderful piece of art in their own right. Sometimes they give a clue about the story. So I was reading a book with my son last night, and we looked at them and said, well, what do you think's happening? And it was Clem and Crab, the story. So about a little girl who goes to the seaside, and the end paper at the front was the beach covered in litter. And at the end, it was all clean and tidy. And throughout the story, she's got her environmental message. So it's really interesting looking at end papers with children to try and get them to think a bit more deeply about the book. So it's become a bit of an obsession and a costly one.
And we're going to talk about books for Year 6 in just a moment, but even, when end papers are very simple, even the colours that are chosen, it can be one single colour, but a choice has been made there. And when you stop and talk to either illustrators or designers, they can tell you why they chose that colour. It's not random. So it's endlessly
very good.
Fascinating. Anyway, we're going to be talking about Year 6 readers today. And obviously, at this age, children are much more confident with their reading, but their interests are becoming more and more diverse, if you like. And it's an important age. I once heard Maurice Gleitzman talking about why he writes for the 9+ age group before they get to the teenage years, because he, expressed how important it was to write about the issues that he writes about, obviously with great humour, but before the hormones kick in, he described it as. It's a real time to help children form their identities, their moral compass, if you like, as well. So there's a lot going on, I think, with this age group, and therefore thinking carefully about our book selection, I think is important. What would you say about Year 6 readers and the sorts of things, in general terms, that you would consider?
I think every year group in the primary phase would argue their year group is one of the most important. And I think you could definitely argue it for Year 6. Obviously, they go off to secondary school, and we hear so often that they don't read for pleasure at secondary school as often, or don't have as much opportunity to. Or, as you say, hormones take over, their social lives take over, and reading gets pushed further and further back. So by building up a reading repertoire for the children and giving them that before they leave primary, I think it's so important if you're wanting to build the children as readers and create readers for the future.
Because it might disappear for a while. This is what I found with my own son, who was a reader at primary school, and then I would say through most of his secondary career, reading didn't feature that much, but it came back later. And I think if you've set those foundations, it will come back when they're ready.
It's that, isn't it? If they leave school at primary and they've never enjoyed reading, then it's likely that will remain the case. Whereas some of my children, I know that, they're looking forward to going off to secondary and doing other things, but I know also they have that love of reading. So they'll always hopefully come back to it, whether it's next year, 2 years, 5 years, it's there for them, isn't it?
Yeah, really important. So let's have a look at our presentation. Oh, Stephen, I was being so vain doing it without my glasses, and I can't actually see to put the presentation on. So the glasses are going to have to go on at least for a moment, because I couldn't see the cursor. So here we are. It's choosing books for the Year 6 classroom. And I'm going to keep the glasses on. Vanity's just going to disappear. So we're thinking here about, this very wide range of interests. And it's interesting, I did a library audit this week, and there were plenty of good books in the library, but they were all of a particular kind. And I realised just how limited the range was that was being offered to Year 6 readers in this particular class, or in this particular school. So we do really need to think about the whole range, not only of reading interests, but children's background interests too. And I've just put a selection up here on the screen. So if I talk about a couple of the ones that really I think shouldn't be missed in lots of ways. So Jill Lewis, A Street Dog Named Pup, is obviously a story in the vein of Black Beauty, in as much as it's a conscience awakening book about the treatment of animals, and in this case dogs. So there are lots of dogs that have, through breeding, might have short noses, or all sorts of things that we humans have done that take dogs away from their wolfishness, their original dog state. And as a result of that, they have all sorts of inherited problems. It's also about dogs that get discarded and thrown out on the street. It's about the love story between a boy, a child, and his dog, and the dog finding his way back to his owner. So beautifully written. And Jill has also created a mythology for dogs, the original dog and the dog mythology, and how the dogs became separated from humans, and what the cost of that was to the dog. Anyway, a street dog named Pup, brilliant read. Any that you would want to pick out?
Definitely Show Us Who You Are by Elle McNichol. I read that with my class last year, and they loved the technology side of it. So it's sort of semi-dystopian, is it? Set not too, it doesn't feel like it's too far away, the world that Elle writes about. So it's a company called Pomegranate who are trying to create AI versions of people who have passed away, but it turns out there's a deeper, darker reason for them using this AI technology. And it was really well written, and the interaction between the two main characters was fantastic. So my children don't all love reading, but for that particular book, they were all fully engaged and really, really wanted to know more.
And why is it the company Pomegranate are very interested in the protagonist for a particular reason, aren't they?
Yes. Yeah. I don't know if does that give too much away? I don't know. Are we allowed
Well,
to
it's teachers that we're talking to mainly.
Yeah.
So I think it's quite interesting for them to.
So it's almost like the owner of Pomegranate or the developers of Pomegranate want to create a perfect person. So there's lots of obviously dark morals involved with this, and lots of conversations to have in class about whether, if someone had something that made them neurodivergent or a physical disability, is it something that should be removed from them? And it was really interesting conversation because children were coming up with talking points that you might not expect them to, asking questions about the rights and wrongs of this sort of technology, and also whether it could actually happen one day in the future. And I'm sure Elle tweeted something not too long after the book was published that there are plans for this kind of thing to be in development, which is kind of frightening, I guess.
Indeed. And that often is the best kind of science fiction. It's often just one step ahead of where we are.
Yeah.
Just while we're talking about books that have those serious issues in them, AJ and the Mumbai Sun. This is about AJ, who's a street child, sells newspapers on the railway and actually forms a cooperative with a team of his friends to create a newspaper, which they're going up against the big corporates. So it's all about taking action in that story. So I wanted to flag that one by Varsha Shah. Also just out in paperback, Frank Cottrell Boyce's Noah's Gold, which had me in stitches from the very first page. So Noah is accidentally off on his sister's field trip. There's a whole bit of the story where he's made sandwiches for his sister, put them in the back of the car or the minibus, and the minibus whizzes off and he's still in the back of the minibus. Now they're actually supposed to be going to a big warehouse, which is a sort of Amazon-like warehouse. It's been selected for their geography field trip, and the geography teacher is driving the minibus using the sat nav as his guide, but the sat nav is one of those that just doesn't take you to the right place, and they end up on a ferry that takes them to an isolated Scottish island, and that's where the adventure starts. I mean, it is an adventure. It's very funny. The word that I would use is reset, because there's something in this story about having to reset the internet, which gets broken. But if you take that word, it's also about resetting our lives and considering what's really important. So I think this is reset and a play on that word is important for this story.
I think he does that so well to me as well. Sorry, Nikki.
No, I was going to say we've had animals, science fiction, adventure, but what were you going to say?
Just about Frank Cottrell Boyce, his writing always has that underlying message, doesn't it? But it's written with warmth and with humour. I was going to also mention about Padraig Kenny's book, The Monsters of Rookhaven, and the Shadows of Rookhaven too, which they're absolutely stunning books. For me, I think that's a book you need to indulge yourself in. I'm not sure it would. I don't know if I'd be able to read it aloud and give it, its best version. I think it's one to get lost in yourself because it's such an enthralling world. But it's an absolutely brilliant piece of writing.
So in Rookhaven, they're all monsters, aren't they?
Yeah.
Think a little bit Addams Family, but as you say, it's a much warmer story than that.
It's not monsters in the traditional sense, is it? It's not all scary and horrible. And there's also the idea of cutting between worlds, like in Philip Pullman's worlds as well. So it's sort of fantasy, dark adventure.
Yeah. And Mirabelle, the central character, needs to find out who her mother. She's been adopted really by the monsters of Rookhaven, Haven being a safe place for the monsters from the outside world.
Yeah.
And there's a fantastic character in this who is a presence, certainly just a presence in the first book, called Piglet.
Yeah.
who lives in the
It's
dungeon.
amazing. You're just trying to get to Piglet each time. What's Piglet going to do next? Brilliant.
Yeah, really good. So, you know, Gothic horror, animals, adventure, science fiction, mystery. We need it all on our shelves in year 6. So it's about going away and doing a quick audit, isn't it, to make sure that you have that selection available. So let's have a look at. So I want to talk a little bit about quick reads. I mean, are they important in year 6? Do you think?
I think so. I think definitely. Well, both in terms of reading aloud with the class, because some children do struggle to. I've just done a reading survey with them this week to find out their opinions of how their reading's gone and what they've enjoyed. And some of them have said, when it's a long story that we're sharing as a class, I struggle to remember, even if it's daily. I struggle to remember what happened yesterday or last week, and joining all those dots can be difficult for them. So shorter reads might benefit them. They're just as rich. And we can get, different messages, different ideas from these shorter stories as well. But as you say, it's about selecting the right ones, isn't it?
So one of the reasons that I put, for example, Philip Pullman's Clockwork on here, which I think is much better as a year 6 book than a year 3 or 4, and you sometimes see it placed there because it's short, and the assumption is it's short, therefore it's for younger children. I've also put Timothée de Fontbell's Saving Celeste. These are not lesser books because of their length. And they're not books. I have got the Barrington Stoke books up on the screen here, but I wanted to make that point. This is not just for struggling readers. This is for all readers. I mean, I sometimes like a short read. I sometimes feel outfaced when I pick up, a 1,000-page War and Peace. I have to be really in the right mood to start a book like that.
I think that's true of the children too, isn't it? That sometimes you don't want to sit with a massive tome on your lap and think I've got to get through this. You want to enjoy it. Another one I'd mention, I'm sure you've seen it before, is Sean Tan's Tales from Outer Suburbia, because it's one you can dip in and out of, all stories that aren't necessarily linked together. And there's the Ghost as well, the 13 Tales, which do link together by the end. But you can read them as individual stories too. So we've got lots of fans of that in year 6 too.
That's a really good point, because I've mentioned quick reads, but I haven't put short story collections on here. And I would always have a good bank of short story collections, not only for the children to read, because often I have found that they go for the novels rather than the short stories themselves. But they're ideal for me as a teacher to pick up and read a story from. I love Blackberry Blue, Jamila Gavin. And actually yesterday in that library audit that I mentioned, there were only 2 short story collections. That was for the whole school. And that was the total number of short story collections that we found. Do you know the Paul Jennings series?
I know Paul Jennings, the writer. I know he's sort of famed for his short story work, isn't he?
He's absolutely fantastic and really hooks readers in. I don't know, especially those that we might say are not as engaged by reading as others. He's got a real talent of hooking them in. I've got some of the Barrington Stoke books on there as well. Peter Bunzell's latest, A Clockwork Queen, and Steve Cole, Stitched Up, which is one in that sequence of books. There are 4 books that he's produced now that all have different social issues at their heart, and this one is about the fast fashion industry. And of course, a bit of Chris Priestley. I love a bit of horror.
Yeah. Seven Ghosts is a popular one with us as well, the Chris Priestley one.
Fantastic. And of course, he's done short story collections. Yeah. Uncle Montague's Tales of Terror. I mean, they really are terrifying. Let's have a look, see what else we've got. So, by year 6, have we moved away from the picture books and the graphic novels or not? She says, totally, in a totally transparent way. Do your class still enjoy visual texts?
Yes, I'd say we're well stocked in school, but we have probably more of the picture books and graphic novels, and that's what they would pick up out of choice. more often than the larger novels.
Mm.
Not true of all, but certainly they go to graphic novels, especially. They're absolutely in love with graphic novels.
Yeah. What would you say for anybody listening that thinks that somehow that's not as real a reading experience, or not as challenging a reading experience, that somehow we're dumbing down? What would you say to them?
We have this conversation with parents, and I've heard children come in, and sometimes a child has given me a book back and said, Mum said I can't have this because it's just a comic or whatever, which is really, it's quite disheartening, because you want them to have a wide reading diet and you want them to experience all manners of reading. And if graphic novels is the love, then we should be encouraging it. There's the storylines in graphic novels that you can access now are so rich and varied. It's not, just a comic. And even there'll be lots of comic book fans saying, don't call them just a comic, because obviously that's diminishing them somewhat. But you can unpick things, you can talk about the story, you can talk about the artwork, the mood, the color, storylines that are interwoven in these graphic novels. And they're not all there plain and obvious. You really have to work hard to get to them. And that's one of the beauties. I think sometimes you could argue graphic novels are maybe to extend your reading a bit further rather than dumbing it down.
I would agree entirely. And I know many adults who haven't learned the skills. Maybe that's part of it. They haven't yet learned the skills themselves of reading those books because they've not given themselves time to get to know how they work. Obviously, again, there's a vast range of complexity. You were talking about one earlier when we had chatted that I thought sounded really interesting, because it's not one I'd heard about.
So it's called Another Kind, by Kate May and Trevor Breen. And it's about there's a group of children who are depicted on the front there, and they are sort of sectioned away in America in what looks like Area 51. And they're sectioned away because they have different powers and different abilities. So most of them can turn into animals, some can turn into other creatures too. But they live in a very peaceful life until one day the security of this compound is breached. So they have to go on the run and they have to try and keep safe. So from there, we learn more about the different characters' backstories, about their previous lives when they were on the run before, what's happened to their parents, where they came from, but also their current selves as well. So we've got a love story happening. You've got the normal things that you might find in stories like friendship and trust and identity. There's gender identity happening in there as well. So that's a prime example of the richness I think graphic novels can offer. So I definitely recommend that. And it's not long out, and I've not had it long in the classroom, but I brought it into the classroom, and this is probably the first time I've had it in my hands since I brought it in, because it's just been passed around, and the artwork's stunning as well. It's just a beautiful piece of work, and there's action, adventure, there's all sorts in there. So it's one for everyone, I would say.
Have the children fed back to you about what it is that appeals to them?
Lots of them are transfixed by the artwork. I'll try and show you a spread, see if I can find one of interest. And we've got, that might give something away. We've got all sorts going on. So it's got technology. It's got sort of the Marvel / X-Men.
Show us again, Stephen.
Well.
I'm just going to remove the slide, and then you'll be able to show us, and people will be able to see more clearly.
So this is some of the children discussing what went wrong, why their security was breached, what happened, why they're in this mess. And you can see some of them have to mask. So there's that idea about maybe neurodivergence happening. It's just an incredibly rich story. But yeah, the children have said particularly the artwork draws them in. And that's true when you're talking about picture fiction or even non-fiction. For a lot of my children, it is judging the book by the cover. They want to see the artwork and think, right, that looks interesting. That's for me.
And there are a lot of novels as well that have great artwork with them now. I'm thinking about The Secret Horses of Briar Hill, which has Levi Pinfold's fantastic illustration in there. The Song from Somewhere Else, again, Levi Pinfold, but this time with A.F. Harold. And, that just adds a different level of imagination to a story. The idea that somehow pictures remove your imagination is not true. Our visual imagination feeds on other images. It doesn't come out of a black space. And I think that's sometimes misunderstood as well.
And also some children need that support with that, don't they? It's not, some children will sit there listening to a story. And as I say, some children have said to me, I've struggled to join the dots, and that extra visual support can help there too.
Let's just give a quick mention to some of these other books on the screen, and then I'll show some internal spreads so people get a sense of what they look like inside. I mean, I was really taken with Alta Zaken earlier this year at the Bologna Book Fair. This is from Cicada Books, and it's about grandmother or great-grandmother or grandmother and child in New York, and them not seeing eye to eye. So the grandmother just doesn't understand the boy's world or the world in which he inhabits. She's not keen on the noise, on people dancing, and he just thinks that she's grumpy. And then they're passing the street and there's this tattoo parlor, and she says, I know about tattoos. And at that moment you see the number tattooed on her arm and you realize what her background has been. This is such a deep novel on so many levels, but it is about these two family members coming to understand each other, and consequently we as readers learning that you can't take other people at face value. Is incredibly moving, and that is also something to say, isn't it, about these stories, that they can be very powerful and very moving and move you to tears, in fact. The Tiago de Moraes, I think it's Tiago de Moraes' book about ancient Greece. Actually, it might not be. Sorry, no, he did the map. He did the atlas of ancient Greece. But this graphic novel here, being a little bit like Marcia Williams with the comic approach to the myths and legends of ancient Greece. Love Corpse Talk. What a great concept, you know, the chat show with all dead characters. So there are lots of these, aren't there, in the series? We've got kings and queens, and we've got explorers, and we've got scientists. Have you read any of those, Stephen?
We do have the kings and queens and scientists in our school library. Well, when they're there, again, often they're in children's hands, which is where you want them. But yes, we've got some of the corpse talk.
Let's have a look at some of the insides. So this is Alta Zaken that I was talking about. This is Mason Mooney, which is one of Flying Eye's graphic novels. So he's a detective, and this is the second book in that series. So very different visual style. Oops. My laptop's not playing ball. No Country. Have you read No Country?
I haven't, no.
Okay, so this is a sort of a war, conflict, refugee story. Would work very well with Year 6, but it's one of those, I think we have to urge everybody to read these things themselves so they know what it is that they're putting on the bookshelf, because some of them do have very dark themes. This one is from a Corpse Talk book. This one is Sisters of the Mist, which is also from Flying Eye. I did want to just mention this briefly because I think it's ideal for that very top end of Year 6, the transition as they're moving into secondary, because it is a rites of passage, a growing up story. It's about 3 sisters, and the older sister, Margot, is becoming a teenager, and it's about her growing apart and becoming different to her younger sisters. It reminded me a little bit about Julius Sardar's book, The Queen in the Cave, which also has a similar theme, but is a picture book. I think they're just great for this age group in particular. So having a laugh, well, we're getting to that part of the year where we all need a laugh because we've been working jolly hard. So what makes you laugh, Stephen?
I like very irreverent humour. so comedians are like people like Bob Mortimer, who's just daft, basically. In my reading, on there again, Frank Cottrell Boyce writes with great humor. Millions is probably one of my all-time favorite children's books. I think maybe now some of the cultural reference might be lost, but I was brought up in a Catholic family, so he has all the religious references, and then there's the moral quandary about what they should do with the money, and there's lots of jokes in there, lots of silliness. So yes, quite like a bit of irreverence in my humor.
Have you read Noah's Gold yet?
I haven't, no, and it needs to be on my list, doesn't it?
It does, because if you enjoyed Millions, you'll see lots of connections, I think, with Noah's Gold, although it's not a repeat of that book, but there were lots of touch points I felt as I was reading it. I mean, I love Adam Barron, and he's got a new book coming out, Some Sunny Day. Interestingly, I did notice that Frank Cottrell Boyce had written a really good recommendation, and had said that he thought Adam Barron was one of the finest writers for children writing at the moment. And I absolutely loved his book. So this is the fourth book, but it's the same characters, Cymbeline.
Yeah.
Cymbeline, what's the second name?
Igloo.
Yes, Cymbeline Igloo.
Yeah.
One of the best names ever. You've been reading one of these, haven't you?
Yes, I read Boy Underwater when it first came out, and I've got the other books in the series too, following Cymbeline's journey. Boy Underwater is what we're reading now as a class, because I thought the humour was there, and there is, when you read it the third, fourth time, the jokes are still funny. It's a good sign. But there's also, it's a bit similar to how Frank Cottrell Boyce writes. There is the humour and the silliness, and when you're reading aloud, there are words to say that maybe you wouldn't rather say if you could avoid it as a teacher. But there's also the underlying deeper serious issues, which it ticks lots of boxes, and it's very well written. There's lots of hidden surprises in his books, in Adam Barron's books. And he's not an author you hear a lot about. You do hear about your Frank Cottrell Boyces, and I know The Beast and the Bethany's been well talked about as well. But you don't hear many people, or I don't hear many people talking about Adam Barron's work, but I definitely recommend it.
We have to change that then, don't we, Stephen? We've got to change that. Everybody needs to rush out and buy Boy Underwater and read up to Some Sunny Day. I did make a podcast with Adam last year, so if anybody's watching this, they might want to listen to that. So Adam's also a lecturer in creative writing, so he knows his trade very well. I like dark humour, so I've often thought about myself as someone who's had a humour bypass. I'm very interested in humour, and actually it's probably not true, because although I wouldn't choose to go and see a comedic film, when I see something that's very good, it does make me laugh, and I suddenly realise I haven't had this humour bypass. It's just that some things are not very good humour.
It's a very subjective thing, isn't it? It's hard to say you're a comedy writer, I guess, or a reader of comedy, because it's so varied just within its own umbrella, I guess.
But I do like The Beast and the Bethany, and I do like sort of dark humour. And actually I loved, this is not dark humour, but I loved Sleepover Takeover by Simon James Green. So this is about Otis and his friend. It's the end of year 6, and they're about to go off to secondary school. And these two friends, Otis is what I think the marketing blurb describes him as a geek, but he's very much an outsider in his school. He's never been invited for a sleepover, but he's got one true friend, and because of that he can cope. He's quite happy that it's just the two of them, but they're actually going off to different secondary schools, and this is a real problem for Otis, not so much for his friend, who's a little bit more self-assured and confident with his own identity. Anyway, they do get invited to a sleepover at a house of a boy who is incredibly rich and holds the most amazing birthday parties. I mean, I think he took the entire class, except the two of them, to Disneyland for one of his sleepover parties. So it's over the top. And Otis and his friend do get invited to this, and all sorts of things go wrong. There's an illusionist there. It's mayhem, basically. But through this process, he discovers some new friends, and he'd always thought, oh, you know, that girl's too athletic, she's too popular, she wouldn't be interested in me. And it's very much about finding your tribe. But in order to do that, you have to be brave enough to go out and look for friendship. And so I put this one on here because to me that seems like the ideal year 6 book as well. Anyway, I don't know if you've read it, but if not,
no, another one for the list.
It's one for the list, and one that doesn't really take you to difficult places, I think, that you wouldn't want to cover as a read aloud with a class. I think it's safe territory is what I'm saying. Also love Listen Layla by Yasmin Abdelmajid, showing that, you know, humor can go hand in hand with activism. So yeah, some of the insides. So there you are. That is from Sherlock. There you are, Sherlock Bones. Actually, I've discovered quite a few people have used that title, Sherlock Bones. It's a good one, though. Right, and reading for pleasure means non-fiction too. Any children in your class read non-fiction that is not necessarily connected to the curriculum, but just because they enjoy it?
There are a few. I'd say they're in the minority at the moment in my class I've got this year, but we do have, even in year 5 and 6, we've got children who love the Little People Big Dreams books, and they pore over those and want to learn more, and then that takes them to sort of bigger reads, the Kate Pankhurst books, for example, which give a bit more detail about different important women. So the biographical work is a big one, a big tick. There's one girl in particular who I always think of because she tells me quite often that reading, you know, she hasn't got time and she doesn't want to. But when I showed her this book, so Rachel Ignatowski's book, her artwork is always stunning. I think she's got a new one about computing, the history of computing at the moment, just out recently. Another one, What's Inside a Flower, and it's just beautiful to look at as a piece of art. But obviously there's the non-fiction learning there for the children too, and they pore over the illustrations, and almost by osmosis they're learning about these important people or important parts of history. And so yeah, I think the art, again, it goes back to what we talked about with graphic novels. The artwork for my children is really, really important, and it's eye-catching and engaging from the cover.
Really interesting to hear you say that. I think she did one on ecosystems as well. I really do recommend that one. I wanted to pick up Roma Agrawal for How Was That Built? So Roma Agrawal is a structural engineer, female structural engineer who's worked on some amazing buildings, including the building of the Shard, which if I were to look outside my window now, I'd be able to see that. And I was actually up the Shard when I read this book. And I was so inspired because it's very technical. That's why I've put it here in year 6. So people, or it could even be key stage 3. So people often think that illustrated nonfiction is for younger children, but most of these books on here are very detailed and technical and challenging. And How Was That Built will really appeal to that child that likes the technical information. I was so enthralled by her writing that I did go and read her adult book, which is just called Built. And as I confided into you earlier, I fell in love with concrete as a result of reading that. She made concrete feel so poetic to me. She was obviously so in love with this substance, and it really rubbed off on me. I think she's actually writing a new book, which is all about screws and nails and the bits that hold buildings together, and I can't wait to read it. And maybe I should have just been a structural engineer instead. But isn't it great when nonfiction can do that and open you up to a world that is not your world and enthuse you about it?
I think for the children, it shows that, you know, often in lessons you might be trying to teach something and they don't always see the relevance. They think, well, why do we need to learn about this? And then you show these amazing people and these amazing inventions and creations that humankind has helped to develop, and things start to fit together for them. They start to say, oh yes, I can see the links now, I can see why it's relevant. So I think it's really important.
Lands of Belonging, that's coming out in July, so next month, from Nosy Crow. This is really fascinating history. It's here to celebrate 75 years of Indian independence, from Britain and the partition. Not celebrating the partition, but remembering the partition and where people have come from. So the diaspora of Britain has a lot to gain, really, from reading about. It's written as though it's your history, but equally the rest of us have a lot to learn about what makes Britain and where Britons have come from. Really love the way that this book has been put together. You don't have to be loud. I put this in here because, again, I think this is really important for children in year 6, recognizing that there are different personalities and celebrating those, and making shyer children or quiet children realize that there's more than one way to be successful, and it's not all about performance and being an extrovert. So yes, just some of the ones that we are highlighting here, but of course, so much good non-fiction around at the moment. So a few internal spreads. This one is from Sisters, and it's a celebration of famous sisters through history. So you get that biographical detail, but you also then have themes that are picked up in the book. So in this case, all about witch mania and how women have been treated in the past. Lots of other themes in there as well. This one is from the book about, I think, sport. Ready, Set. What was the title again? Let me just double check. On your marks, get set, gold. So have you got lots of children in your class who are keen on sport?
Yeah, we have this book. It's all about the history of the Olympics, isn't it? And all the introductions of the different sports. So it's a well-thumbed one, and it's incredibly detailed. And again, I think for lots of my children, they want to be entertained in reading. That's the number one priority. So going to non-fiction as their first port of call might not be natural for them, but when they see books presented in this way, that it's not just a list of facts, or it can be interesting. It can be presented in an interesting way as well. So it definitely turns them onto that genre.
So here we are, and you can see why I was so enamored of how was that built. This is from the book about architecture. So there are some pages like this that have lots of space in them to breathe, but then there's some very detailed. Let me just move on to the next page. Quite detailed information in there, and it's organized under these things: how to build tall, how to build long, how to build underground. So even the way in which it's organized, I found really fascinating as well. How to build a dome. Wow, what I've learned about how you build domes. You can tell I'm excited. Okay. This is from Darren McNulty's book about Wild Child. So on to rhyme, rhythm and poetry. Does that get much of a look in your class?
We promote poetry as much as we possibly can. What I'd love the children to be more engrossed in is verse novels, particularly. We've looked at lots of different collections of poetry. We've read parts of the Stephen Camden book. We've read some of Matt Goodfellow's Bright Bursts of Colour. Carl Nova was a big hit when we read his book in detail as well, his first book. But yeah, verse novels, they do find a bit harder to maintain the concentration with, but that's one for the future.
Tell us a little bit about Everything All at Once.
So this is, I would only put this in year 6. I don't think it would go elsewhere in a primary school.
No.
It's about the kind of the end days of year 6, but more about starting school and secondary school life. And I think it's very honest that life at secondary school can be hard, and there can be difficulties, and there can be falling outs, arguments, themes like bullying maybe, but it's real. it's an honest portrayal of secondary school life. And I think for children, lots of my children are very, very nervous. We're a small school and they're going off to a very big secondary school. So it's a very big transition for them. And to see, not to show them that you will struggle at secondary school, but to see that it's not unique, to see that it's a shared experience and it's nothing to be ashamed of if they do find transition difficult. It might be nice to show them from that aspect.
I mean, this book deals with all the colours of what it's like to be in secondary school. It has its highs and it has its lows. And we were chatting just a little bit before we went live and talking about knowing your children really well, and that in some places, in some of the urban schools that I've been working in, where we have very big primary schools, a primary school that's almost the size of a secondary school, and that might be, a much easier read than for somebody in your context. So I think to be aware of that, and I'm sure people are listening anyway but always reading the book before you share it is important, isn't it? Have you read Zombierella or Frankenstein, the Joseph Coella?
Yes. In fact, my Frankenstein has gone missing, so a child must have really enjoyed it. Zombierella I absolutely loved. I really enjoyed that. Frankenstein I only read once. Tried to read them a couple of times, the shorter ones, before I give them to children. But again, they've got the gore, the right side of not too gory. Obviously, it's told in verse, and it's an entertaining joining of two stories, isn't it?
So just have a quick look inside. Really just to make the point that certainly all of our collections at Just Imagine, we work hard to make sure that they're inclusive, and that's across the board, whether it's fiction, illustrated text, non-fiction. We have to be constantly alert to making sure that the packs that we put together for school are inclusive throughout. I'm sure that everybody's listening, including yourself, do that all the time with the books that you're purchasing. And reading aloud, I'm guessing that's still very important for you in year 6 and maybe into your final read aloud of the year. What have you chosen?
Well, we're on Boy Underwater. We've had a successful year, I would say, of reading. We finished Loki, which, going back to the humour, I think that's a good example of very dry humour. And it a little bit went over the children's heads, but I was chuckling away as I was reading aloud at some of the humour. We've read Crater Lake, we've read High Rise Mystery by China Jackson, The Imaginary at the start of the year. So hopefully a good range of reading aloud. And the children have all enjoyed different books, which again, I think that's a measure of some success, hopefully.
Well, just a few on here. I think an opportunity to read some of the classic books that children may not reach for themselves, like Susan Cooper, The Dark is Rising, or Mrs. Frisbee, and then Rats of Nim. Of course, making sure that poetry is part of that read aloud. Here I've just got Caroline Duffy's book of children's poetry. And I just thought the other day, I was talking to Nicolette Jones, who put together this book, Rites of Passage, Words to Read Before You Turn 13. And there are lots of snippets in here, not only from children's novels, but words of wisdom and adult novels. And I just thought they were really interesting snippets that you could pick up and just read and talk about. So I thought that one might make an interesting class read aloud. Not one that you would read every day, but would just reach for on the shelf, dip into, pick something out, and then have a good old book talk about it. So we've covered a lot of territory in the last hour. Is there anything else, any parting thoughts that you think we should have mentioned that?
When we were talking about picture fiction, we talked about graphic novels, but not necessarily picture books. I'll bow to your expertise, obviously, but books that we've used with success, both as in terms of studying them, but also just to read, to enjoy, would be books like Gary Crew's The Water Tower and The Viewer. books from Book Island would be The Bird Within Me was an absolute hit across class, learning about this Swedish artist and how she grew up, but the artwork in there was absolutely beautiful as well. So picture books, we talked about graphic novels, but I think, again, for our parents, we're trying to tell them, yes, let your children read picture books in year 6. That's okay. That's not a problem. They don't have to be reading 400 pages every time they pick up a book.
Absolutely. I mean, I had on the slide the Armin Grader book, The Island, but his other books as well, you know, the one that was published just last year, Diamonds, which is all about the diamond mining industry. I mean, they're not for younger children at all, really. You know, they're for year 6 and upwards, I would say. So, yeah, definitely picture books as well as graphic novels. It's been an absolute treat talking to you today, Stephen, and catching up with you. So thank you for taking the time to come and explore this idea of choosing books for the year 6 classroom. And thank you to everybody that joined us as well.